My name is Ethan Olson. I'm the Director of Native Landscapes here at Keep Indianapolis Beautiful.
AIB is an environmental nonprofit focused on helping people and nature thrive. Today, I am here to talk to you about planning and designing a landscape of native plants. This is a product of the Adopt-A-Block Plant Distribution webinar series. A little bit about my background. I was raised in Chesterton, Indiana, near the Indiana Dunes. I studied environmental management. I am a certified arborist, a certified pesticide applicator, and I've been working in the field of professional landscaping with native plants for about 5 years now. The purpose of this presentation is to discuss some of the key strategies in selecting native plant material and creating landscape or garden designs to accomplish your landscaping goals. So by definition, a perennial plant is one that has a life cycle longer than 2 years. There are many perennial plants that live much longer than 2 years. This is in contrast to what is called an annual plant. An annual plant is a species of plant that completes its entire life cycle within the course of 1 year. There are much different landscaping and design strategies that one would implement in incorporating annual plants into their landscape or garden. And unfortunately, we don't have the time to cover those annual landscaping strategies in this presentation. Second note, it's important that you guys understand that any landscaping goal can be accomplished using plants native to your geographic area. That is, unless, of course, your goal is to plant exotic plant species that aren't native to your area. The third bit of importance here is that you guys recognize that non-native plants can serve a valuable function within a landscape. That value won't be as high as what you receive from native plants. However, we must remember that invasive plant species will not serve that valuable function, and they should be avoided or removed at all costs. So what are you trying to accomplish with your landscape? You might be interested in creating privacy, whether that be blocking sight lines from neighbors or from the road. You might be trying to create a sound barrier. Maybe you're trying to appeal to aesthetic interests, so make something look nice. You might be trying to do some management of the stormwater on your property, so diverting the rainwater from your rooftops into a rain garden, or moving water from a wet spot of your property to somewhere else through a bioswale. Your goals might be to create a place of ecological value, attract wildlife, or support your pollinator species, etc. There are a lot of goals that I haven't mentioned here, and it's important to understand that a lot of these goals can overlap. But the sort of first step in your design process is to consider what are you trying to accomplish with your landscape. The first factor we'll discuss is your budget. So before you sort of dive down the rabbit hole of designing your whole yard or your whole landscape, you should think about how much money you're actually willing to spend on your landscape. So some things to remember is you can do your landscape design across phases. This will help you to divide the costs across multiple years. You don't need to plant your entire landscape within 1 year. You can take it piece by piece, and if you have extra money that pops into your budget 1 year, you can add additional plants or create another garden. So sort of a ballpark estimate, a typical garden of native plants might cost you between 50 cents to $2 per square foot. And this is just for the plant material. It does not include things like mulch or water costs. So that would mean that a 500 square foot garden could cost you between $250 and $1,000 for the initial investment. These conditions are going to drive the types of plants that you can use, or sort of the species of plants that you might choose from. So you need to think about sunlight. Is this an area that is going to get sun throughout the entire day? Is it only partly sunny? Is it shaded by buildings or by trees? You also need to consider soil moisture. Is the area that you're looking at a space that is always dry, or is it always wet, or is it dry during some parts of the year and flooded during other parts of the year? There is a huge variability in the pickiness of different plant species in terms of the amount of soil moisture they can tolerate. So thinking about that soil moisture is really important consideration to make in the type of landscape that you're designing. This next consideration is something that often goes overlooked. Accessibility. Is this an area of your property that is easy to work on? For instance, a slope might be very difficult to maintain in terms of weeding or watering or mulching. An area that's very far away from your home might be difficult to get tools to, or to get your plant material to, or to run a hose to. So thinking about how accessible your site is going to drive the complexity of your landscape design, and factor into how easy maintenance and installation will be. And sort of the same goes for the size of the space. If you're hoping to landscape a very large space, you're going to need to make strategic decisions in how you are installing your plant material and the design that you're creating in terms of ease of maintenance. So typically a large planting area is going to be easiest to maintain if you're okay with it being a little more wild than highly formalized. So these are some major considerations. Whenever it is feasible, it's best to design your landscape to have aesthetic interests across all times of the year. So this is actually the scenario that has the highest ecological value as well. When you include plants that bloom and produce flowers in the spring, in the summer, and in the fall, that means you're providing pollen and nectar food sources for our insects and birds for as much of the year as possible. And then including plants like grasses or shrubs or trees that look cool in the winter or have aesthetic interest. You're oftentimes also providing overwintering habitat for a variety of different creatures. So this is a major factor of consideration when you are creating your landscape design. The very first thing you need to do is determine your landscaping goals. So for this example, let's say that we want to create a pollinator/butterfly garden for the front of our house. And the reasons we want to do this are to increase sort of the aesthetic interest of our home. We also want to support local wildlife, so increase the ecological value of our property. This is going to sort of increase the curb appeal by having some colors that pop, and some formal landscaping done in front of our house, which will thus increase property value. And sort of a side benefit is these deep-rooted native plants are also likely going to help with stormwater management and pull some of that water away from our home's foundation. Your budget is going to factor into some other decisions you're going to be making soon in terms of the number of plants you're willing to buy, things like that. So let's just say for this example that we're not going to do this garden in phases. We want to plant this entire garden within 1 year, and that our budget is $500. So we've got our goals, we've got our budget. Next, we need to think about the conditions of our site. So how much sun does it get? How wet is the soil? Is this an accessible site? And how large is the space? So, for this example, let's say that the site gets full sun throughout the day, and it's mostly dry, so it's dry to masic meaning sort of the medium moisture level in the soil. Let's say, we know it's right by the front of our home, so we know that it's highly accessible for watering and for tools. And then, just for the ease of this example, let's say that the size of the space is 500 square feet. It's usually more desirable for a person to plant their garden as dense as possible. This is helpful to combat pressure from weeds. So the less open space you have in your garden, the less likely you are to have weeds sort of fly in and occupy those open spaces. However, the more dense you plant your garden, the more expensive your startup costs will be, as you will have to buy more plant material. And your garden is going to fill in over time on its own as your native plants establish and begin to reproduce. Indiana native plants are very good at reproducing by seed and reproducing through their root systems as well. So, it's a balance. Depending on how much money you're willing to spend, it might be a better option for you to plant a less dense garden and keep up with the weeding until your garden fills in on its own. So for this example, let's say that we're going to space our plants at 2 feet. So that means to fill our 500 square foot garden space, we'll need about 250 plants. So this is where we're actually going to choose the species of plant that we want to include in our butterfly garden. We need to make some considerations. Of course, we want to include 3 seasons of bloom and 4 seasons of interest. So we need to make sure that we're including some plants that bloom in the spring, some that bloom in the summer, and some that bloom in the fall. And then we also want to include some stuff that looks cool in the winter and that can serve well as habitat for wildlife. We need to think about the plant size. This is going to be completely dependent on the area that you are landscaping and your landscaping goals. So, if it's right next to your house, do you want to have tall plants or do you want to keep everything short? Do you want to have a blend with sort of the tallest stuff closest to the house and the shortest stuff sort of closest to your walkway? These are things that you need to think about. If you're putting this garden in front of a window, you might not want plants that are so tall that it blocks your window, or plants that are so short that you can't see them from your window. So things to think about when you're selecting your plant species. You also want to think about colors. There are tons and tons of different colors to choose from within the species of plants native to Indiana. And then sort of our trickiest one is determining the number of species that you'd like to include. So from an ecological standpoint, the more species that you include, the higher the ecological value. And this is because you're providing a wider variety of plants serving as food resources for a wider variety of insects or wildlife. Unfortunately, maintenance can be trickier with the more plant species that you choose to include. It can be more challenging to identify all of the plant species that you've chosen, and this problem becomes furthered as those plants begin to reproduce and drop seed, and those seeds sprout. A lot of native plants can be tricky to identify or differentiate from weeds until they get larger. So there is one other factor that you need to think about in choosing the number of plant species. A lot of different nurseries will only sell certain quantities of native plants. So, for example, there are nurseries that will only sell flats of 32 plants or perhaps 50 plants. And if your budget only allows you to purchase 250 plants in total, that will certainly limit the number of species that you can include in your plant palette. So, something that you'll need to work through, and you might end up hopping back and forth between step 5 and step 6 as you make adjustments. There's a lot of really important information in here used for planning. You'll note in the column heads, I've included species, common name, bloom time, the height of the plant, what size of plant I'm purchasing, the quantities that I would like to purchase, and the price of each individual plant. So there's a lot of really important information in here used for planning. Something I need to stress to you guys right now is it's very important that you guys understand why or the function of the species name in Latin. And that is because there are oftentimes different people, different online resources, different catalogs that you might be sifting through that use, different common names than what you might currently recognize. So one example here, let's look at number 11 on this list. Rudbeckia fulgida speciosa is listed as orange coneflower as the common name. You guys might be more familiar with the common name of black-eyed Susan for that Rudbeckia species. Additionally, there are actually a number of different Rudbeckia species that go by the common name black-eyed Susan. So Rudbeckia hirta is one example of a species that goes by black-eyed Susan, which is actually a completely different species than the Rudbeckia fulgida speciosa that I've listed here, and they grow to different sizes. So in order for you guys to avoid sort of mistaken identity, it's very important that you understand the Latin name of the species that you want to include in your plant palette. So in this example, I have a total of 12 different plant species and a total of 256 individual plants, which according to my price cost estimate here is going to cost us $369.60. So we're actually well within our budget. So, as I mentioned before, you might need to bop back and forth between step 5 and step 6 as you're going through this process. But there are a couple strategies I want to relay to you in the design creation process. The first is it's oftentimes a good idea to create clusters of the same plant species within your garden. So this might be planting, 8 to 10 to 20, depending on the size of your space, of the same plant, all within sort of a big bunch. This is really helpful for a couple of reasons. Number one, makes sort of weeding maintenance a lot easier. It's very easy to identify sort of the odd man out in a bunch or cluster of the same species. So you can sort of understand if a weed has invaded your cluster. And additionally, the sort of clusters have very good ecological value. A lot of our pollinator species rely on their eyesight to find their food sources. It's a lot easier for those insects to locate a big bunch of the same color flower than it is to try and pick out one single flower in a rainbow of color. So something to think about. Next strategy is to incorporate sort of patterned layers based on the height of your plant, the colors you're looking for, and when they bloom. It's important to note that you can and you should actually implement both of these design strategies in your landscape. It's good for you guys to recognize that when you're doing these sort of at-home projects, your landscape design only needs to go into as much detail as you need to actually do the installation of your project. So for this example, if I were to have 250 different plant species, I don't need to locate each individual plant. In this example, I've created clusters. I know where I'm going to lay out my different clusters of plants, and in some ways this resembles a layer. But I've included species that bloom at all different kinds of the year. But as long as you understand your design, that should be sufficient. Once you get into sort of the more professional setting or are working with clientele, you might be forced to go into a little more detail, but that's for another day. For this example, if I were to have symbols for all of these different species, so each layer is made up of its own individual pattern based on color, height, and bloom time. And I kind of have my layer of the tallest stuff closest to the house and layer of my shortest stuff closest to the walkway. So, this is just one strategy or one example of landscape design. Here's another very simple layout using symbols to denote the different plant species. Here's a sort of more complicated example. This is actually a real world example of a design I used for one of my planting projects. It might look a little crazy, but if you kind of take it one step at a time, this is actually very easy to lay out and implement. And you'll see that I have all of my shortest species towards the outside of the ring of plants and all the tallest species towards the inside. So ideally all of our plants would be visible from outside of this ring. Here's another, and here's an example for sort of our more tech-savvy individuals. There are a wide variety of software programs that are somewhat easy to use to create landscape designs. This is a little more applicable in the professional setting. Oftentimes, these software-generated designs take a little more time to create, so keep that in mind. An advantage of using a software program, if you really needed to have an idea of what your planting might look like in front of your home, these software programs are really good at showing you examples of that. A few resources for you guys. First are some resources on where to buy native plants. GrowIndianaNatives.org is a growing database of different nurseries throughout the entire state that sell native plants. So you can look up where nurseries are based on your location. Great resource for finding where you can buy native plant material. The second resource I've listed here is Spence Nursery. They are a native plant nursery located in Muncie, Indiana. This catalog actually shows prices for a ton of different native plants. It's a good resource for you to get a baseline of what your planting projects might cost. I've also included a couple of links to help you understand what some of our native plants might look like. MissouriBotanicalGarden.org is very easy to use. It shows you a couple pictures of the plant and gives some very easy to understand bits of data on how large the plants get, what kind of soil they like, when they bloom, things like that. And IllinoisWildflowers.info does the same, but goes into much greater detail. So if you really want to learn a lot about the native plants that you are researching, I'd recommend going there. It's also a website that will tell you what animals and insects these native plants attract and what you might be attracting to your property. The last resource I've listed, KIBI.org, that's our website, is a database of native plants created by multiple different entities, including the Indiana Native Plant Society, the DNR, the Nature Conservancy, and a few other partners. But it's a large spreadsheet that hosts sort of recommended native plants for the landscape setting. It tells you how large they get, what color they are, what their soil and sunlight preferences are, and things like that. So it's a resource that I almost constantly use in my plant palette design, and I highly recommend that you guys take a look at it. I hope you all learned something today, and I hope that you're able to put some of this information to good use. And happy gardening.